Hi everyone, my name is Jill and I completed my literature review on self-management. I have always been particularly interested in this intervention, and after learning about it during week 10, I wanted to continue learning more so that I could apply it to my own work. A little bit about myself: I am a special education teacher in a public middle school in Pennsylvania. I currently have 6 students with dual diagnoses of autism and intellectual disabilities. And a major thing that we focus on in my program is independence in all areas, which is why I decided to focus on self-management for this final project. So I'm going to start with a quick review of self-management. We learned it is an evidence-based practice and that the National Standards Project determined it as an established intervention for early childhood, elementary, middle, and high school age students with ASD. This intervention promotes improvements in play, social, adaptive, behavioral, and communication skills in the home, school, and community. So therefore, depending on a child's needs, this intervention can be individualized to target specific skills in a variety of areas and be generalized across a variety of settings. Self-management teaches children with autism how to independently identify their own behaviors, record their own behaviors, and reinforce themselves for those behaviors. So when they're identifying their own behaviors, they learn what is or is not behavior and regulating it. When they are recording their own behaviors, they determine whether they did or did not engage in behavior, recording it and monitoring patterns or progress with those recordings. And then when they're reinforcing themselves for the behaviors, they're taking responsibility, being trusted to reinforce at correct times, and feeling proud of themselves when engaging in those appropriate behaviors. I think self-management is really interesting because it can be used to increase desired behaviors or decrease unwanted behaviors, which sometimes also results in both of these occurring simultaneously. The intervention can increase social initiations, social responses, sharing, play, self-help skills, and most importantly, independence. And on the other hand, it can be used to decrease stereotypic behavior, disruptive behavior, unwanted vocalizations, and off-task behaviors. Another great thing about self-management is that it can be utilized by almost anyone. I realized more and more after week 10 and after completing my research for this presentation that it is not just limited to one age group or just to people with autism. I realized I use self-management strategies all the time in my own life. While it is an established intervention for people with autism under 22, really anyone can learn to use self-management in their everyday lives. It may just appear differently or have different intensities depending on that person. One thing that did surprise me was that this was established intervention for early childhood. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but I never really looked into this intervention for my students because I didn't know if they would be developmentally ready or if they would have the skills to be successful in implementing this intervention. So I always kind of wondered what the prerequisites would be for a child to be successful with this. And I learned that the person needs to be able to demonstrate the target behavior, discriminate whether the target behavior has occurred or has not occurred, record when the learner has demonstrated that target behavior, and manage their own reinforcers. While self-management programs differ from individual to individual, how to implement the program usually follows the same steps. First, the team wants to identify and clearly define the target behavior that they want to increase or decrease. It's also important that the learner understands this target behavior because they're going to be the ones identifying it and recording it. Next, the team will want to identify appropriate reinforcement. They can do this using a preference assessment, family questionnaires, or their general knowledge of the learner. Third, the team will want to develop a data collection system. There will be one for the service provider and one for the learner. The learner will use a self-recording system to track their own behaviors and monitor their own progress. Next, the team will teach the learner to identify, record, and reinforce the target behavior. This needs to be done in a structured setting before implementing into a natural setting. Prompting strategies can be used, such as modeling, visual cue cards, verbal prompts, and then fade those prompts so that the learner can use the intervention independently. After creating and teaching the program, the team will implement the intervention in one setting at a time. Lastly, the team will monitor progress of the intervention with ongoing checks. These checks will allow them to decide whether if progress is being made and if the intervention can be implemented in other settings. The team will also decide if the self-management program can be faded or if it's a strategy that's appropriate for the learner to use lifelong. Even if a learner reaches independence with the intervention, it is important that the team continues to monitor progress to ensure maintenance and generalization. During my literature search, I found several articles relating to self-management for children with autism. The article titles and authors are listed on this page. While all of the articles were extremely interesting and provided evidence supporting the intervention, I decided to complete my literature review on the article that was most similar to my current practice. Mancina et al.'s article titled Reduction of Inappropriate Vocalizations for a Child with Autism Using a Self-Management Treatment Program. So just a little background information on this research article. The authors included one participant, a 12-year-old girl with autism and an intellectual disability. They focused on decreasing her stereotypic vocalizations. Her verbal communication was being interrupted by her own perseverative vocalizations, for example, humming, whistling, tongue clicking, repetitive phrases. So they wanted to decrease these vocalizations. The authors used a multiple baseline design across tasks. They recorded the data during leisure, pre-vocational, and reading tasks. They started with the leisure tasks, and once the participant reached below a 50% occurrence of vocalizations during the leisure tasks, then the authors moved on to the pre-vocational tasks, and then the 50% occurrence again, and then to the reading tasks. Data was recorded every 10 seconds over a 5-minute period during each task. In their method and procedure sections, the authors described in specific details the teaching of the self-management program. They taught the program for 6 days of intensive instruction for 3 hours per day, with training continuing during the leisure tasks until the participant reached below 50% occurrence of those vocalizations. So the intervention was taught intensively for 6 days and then prompted in those data collection environments. The authors followed a similar approach to teaching self-management as described earlier in this presentation. First, they identified the target behavior through modeling and using note cards that either said quiet or noisy. Using these note cards, They modeled what quiet behavior looked like and what noisy behavior looked like for the participant. Once the participant showed an understanding of identifying these behaviors, the authors taught her how to assess the target behavior using a self-recording sheet. After a timer went off, the participant was taught to check quiet or noisy on the recording sheet. When the participant showed mastery of this step, the authors taught self-reinforcement. The participant received a small reinforcement for each quiet box that was checked, and received a larger reinforcement at the end of the recording sheet if a specified percentage was met. For example, if 6 out of 10 of the boxes were checked quiet, she would receive that larger reinforcement. The authors eventually increased this percentage to increase the desired behavior. Lastly, the participant was taught independence by the authors fading their prompt. They mostly faded their verbal prompts, such as asking, "Were you quiet or noisy?" or "Check it," and giving verbal reminders to the participant as she was tracking her own data. The results of this study showed that self-management was highly effective in decreasing inappropriate vocalizations for the participant. However, while the vocalizations decreased, she still required gestural and verbal prompts to successfully use the program. She did not reach a full mastery level of independence during the time of the study. Also, evidence of generalization was shown, as it took longest for the participant to engage in the target behaviors during the initial program and quicker with results during the second and third programs. There were many strengths to the study. The method and procedures were described in great detail, allowing them to be easily replicated. The participants and setting were also easily replicated, as they were described in detail but did not require extraneous factors. Both the dependent and independent variables were carefully described. The dependent variable was measured repeatedly over time to establish a clear baseline. The independent variable was systematically under the control of the treatment providers. The study was socially valid as it looked at a very significant behavior impacting many aspects of an individual's life. Reliability of recording the vocalizations was high. The authors reported an inter-observer agreement of 95%. There were many strengths to the study that provided evidence and support that self-management is an effective intervention. While there were many strengths to the study and it did provide evidence that this is an effective practice for children with autism, there were a few limitations. One of the biggest limitations was that there was only one participant. While this is common in our practice, it would have been more effective if the authors were able to include more participants in this study. Another limitation was that the participant did not reach independence. She required prompts from the treatment providers throughout the program in order to successfully implement this self-management intervention. Along with that, therefore, the treatment providers could not fade the program during the study. Granted, the study did not last over a long period of time. Therefore, if the program continued, perhaps treatment providers could eventually fade their prompting and the participant could have reached independence with this self-management intervention. After learning about self-management in class and completing my literature review, I thought about the implications this new information has on my practice. Unlike most of you, I am not completing the supervisor hours or sitting for the boards. I am simply taking these courses just to learn more about ABA and help me with my current position, which I love. So this slide just shares some of my reflections of how I could implement self-management into my own special ed classroom. As I said earlier, the biggest goal for my program is to increase my students' independence. Self-management is a huge step in becoming more independent. It shifts the responsibility from the teacher to the student and provides the student with a gained sense of accountability and pride. Each of my students engage in some type of disruptive, maladaptive, or off-task behavior that needs to be decreased. Therefore, I hope to think about what type of self-management system could be implemented for each of those students. It may not be appropriate for all of them at this time in their life, but just by completing this assignment, it definitely got my mind thinking outside the box about ways that each of my students could be motivated by the strategy and successful ways in increasing their independence. As far as decreasing staff, I currently have a 6-to-4 student to adult ratio in my classroom, which is very high, but it's also much needed due to the amount of dependence in self-help areas and behavior areas. By implementing self-management programs, I could decrease the need for this many adults in my classroom, which is both cost-effective and beneficial for the growth of my students. Finally, I would like to take all of this information that I learned and share it with parents and colleagues. A benefit of this intervention is being able to use it across settings. Therefore, I think it would be extremely helpful to have other team members on board with implementing the strategy and monitoring the progress of it. In addition to meeting with my students' team members about this, I would also love to encourage the elementary teachers to look into implementing this intervention with young kids so that they can establish these skills at an early age, since it is an evidence-based practice for early childhood through age 22. The next few slides will be some examples of self-management tools that I have either seen or have implemented in my practice. As for all interventions, each child's program should be individualized to meet his or her needs, but these are just some examples that could spark some ideas of ways for you to use the intervention with a young child that you're working with. Here is an example of a visual self-management chart that a child can use to track his or her behavior throughout an entire school day. I numbered the columns at the bottom just to make it easier to explain, but column 1 would be the period of the day, such as during math or during reading, and then period 2, 3, and 4 are specific behaviors. So did that child remain quiet? Did that child stay in their seat? Did that child answer questions? If they did, they would put a check mark in the green box. If they did not, they would put a check mark in the red box. And then in the 5th column, all the way to the right, you can see a blank space with minutes earned, maybe for computer time or for a specific reward. Depending on how many green boxes were checked or red boxes, that's how many minutes the child would earn as reinforcement. Here is a picture of a visual rating scale that a child can use to identify their feelings and manage their behaviors based on those feelings. I've seen this used with clothespins that can move up and down the scale so the child can visually see where they're at, and then the child can record the number that they're at for specific time intervals throughout their day. This is an actual token board that one of my colleagues uses and has been really successful with a student to self-manage his vocal noises. So I just interviewed her to ask how she implemented it and how the progress is going. So basically the student would make vocalizations all throughout the day, and if there were any comments made about his noises, he just became louder and eventually became very agitated. So she started with reinforcing him with an edible, usually an M&M, every 30 seconds to 1 minute for working quietly. Then, after she saw progress with this, she implemented the timer and the star stickers. So every time the timer went off, she gave the student a star and then also reinforced with that edible. Eventually, she progressed to 2 stars equaling 1 edible, and then 3 stars equaling 1 edible. Along with this, she also increased the time, so he would need to be quiet for 2 minutes to earn 1 star, therefore resulting in 6 minutes to earn an edible. She eventually just kept progressing with this and increasing the times. So now that he's up to an average of 21 minutes of working quietly in order to receive that edible. She noted that he has been extremely successful in reducing his vocal noises by being aware that he was making the noises, and he takes a lot of pride in using this system independently. Here is a picture of vibrating watches that can also be used as part of a self-management program. I'm actually hoping to implement this tool with one of my students so that he can be more independent with tracking his behaviors in all school settings. We talked a little bit about whether self-management programs should be fated or if they can be appropriately used throughout someone's life, and I think these are awesome for people to discreetly manage their behaviors without the whole world knowing. The watches can just be set to vibrate at specific time intervals. So rather than using the loud timer that everyone around the person can hear, the learner can just independently acknowledge his or her own behavior at that time. So just some final thoughts to wrap up. All 3 articles that I read provided evidence to support self-management as an intervention for children with autism. After reading the articles, there is no doubt that there are many benefits to this intervention if it is implemented with fidelity. While it takes time to create, teach, and implement, it is worth it in the end, as there are long lists of benefits that the authors have noted. One benefit that I noted was that this intervention can be implemented for a variety of ages, behaviors, and in a variety of environments. Prompts can be faded over time, and a variety of tools can be used so that the self-management becomes more discreet over time if that's successful for the student. In my eyes, the biggest benefit of this intervention is the increase in independence, responsibility, and accountability. For my adolescents with autism, this is the main thing that we work on and is what is going to help them the most in their lives. My main question after completing this literature review is, what is the biggest barrier for me implementing this intervention? And are there ways to overcome that barrier or those barriers? As I said earlier, it's not going to be appropriate for every single one of my students, but I would like to find ways to try to individualize a program for those students who it would be appropriate. Here is a list of my references if you're interested in checking them out. I hope this presentation was helpful for you in learning more about the intervention and the research behind it. I would love to hear any experiences you have with implementing this strategy, so feel free to reach out at any time. There are definitely a wide variety of ways that self-management can be utilized, so it's always interesting to hear new ideas. I hope everyone has a great holiday and good luck with the exam. Thanks, guys.